Hello, I'm Joe Furia, Executive Director of World Forestry Center, and welcome to the second episode of Adapting to the Era of Megafires, a community and expert summit on catastrophic wildfire in Oregon and beyond. In today's episode, our co-hosts are joined by elected officials from across the state to discuss how we can adapt our communities to the era of megafires. With no further ado, we present Episode 2, Protecting People, Creating Fire-Adapted Communities.
I was calling my mom and saying, I think it's all gone, but I don't know. I didn't sleep for probably 3 or 4 days, and we didn't find out for about 4 days that our house was actually gone. The Mackenzie River is home for me. It's been home for my partner for his entire life. I can't reimagine my life anywhere but here.
Talent is on fire. Oh my God. I want to get to my kid. Oh my God, look at that.
Being a homeless teacher teaching homeless students is really an impossible situation to be in.
It's hard because, my mom lost her stuff for work. My dad lost all his equipment for work. So right now, it's been a big blessing to have people give us clothes, give us blankets, give us towels, things that we need to keep going, even if it's the smallest thing. The smallest help right now is the biggest help to us.
Well, welcome back, everyone. My name is Matt Donegan, and I serve as chair of the Oregon Wildfire Council. And we are very pleased to have you join us. Just a reminder of what this series is all about. Adapting to the Era of Megafires is a video series that is produced based upon the work of the Oregon Wildfire Council, which in turn is based upon the work of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy, which is the best practices on wildfire policy here in the United States. And the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy identifies 3 major goals for wildfire policy. Number 1 is to create fire-adapted communities. Number 2 is to create resilient landscapes. Number 3 is to protect our firefighters to safe and effectively respond to wildfire. So that really forms the structure of our 5-part series, with episode 1 being really the causes and what's at stake, episodes 2, 3, and 4 being those 3 elements of the wildfire policy, and then episode 5 being what do we need to do to implement. So last week's episode was episode 1, which was really how did we get here? What's at stake? And we talked about the 3 major contributors to this era of megafires. One is climate change and the climate conditions that are creating drought, heat, extended wildfire seasons. Number 2 is the buildup of fuels in our forests and our wildlands, our rangelands, and then the third is the growth of our population into fire-prone areas. And so with that, we also talked about the impact to our communities, to our people, to our firefighters. And now we're going to start taking a deeper dive into those elements, starting today with episode 2, which is the impact to our communities and how do we build fire-adapted communities. So with that kind of recap and an introduction, I would like to welcome my 2 co-hosts, Katrina, Holland, and Charles Wilhoite, both of whom serve with me on the Oregon Wildfire Council. Katrina is the executive director of Join, which is a homeless services agency, and Charles Wilhoite is managing director at Willamette Management Associates, which is a wealth management firm, both here in Portland. So, Katrina, Charles, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see
you again.
It's good to see you two both as well. So, I want to turn back to the film clip that we just all had a chance to see, which was really, a recap of the impact of communities of the Labor Day fires, and just hear from both of you your reactions to seeing that very stirring clip. So, Katrina?
That was a very scary situation where we were making a lot of decisions on the fly at Join. At Join, we were operating a COVID emergency camp, 3 of them, with the hopes of trying to help folks who were living on the streets distance. But, with the camp, it was still subject to the elements. And there was a lot of vulnerable folks there who had underlying conditions that were irritated. And so we worked with Multnomah County to try to place folks in hotels temporarily to try to get them out of the smoke. And I think it was really frustrating because either there weren't a whole lot of options for people, because IDs and other things that folks lose while being homeless and undergoing sweeps and other things like that became a real barrier to getting folks into hotels. And so we just spent hours upon hours upon hours, I think over 2 days, trying to get folks into motels. And it just reminded me, like, wow, we are not prepared for the kind of situations that we're going to face in this era of mega fires. For people who are super vulnerable living out in the streets, who already have a decreased lifespan simply from the trauma of being homeless, we're adding to that by leaving them out in the elements during a mega fire. And so I was like, where are the shelters? Where's the safe breathing spaces? Where are they? And it was really frantic, and it was very scary. And on top of that, I think we spent, I want to say, over $80,000 to $85,000 just in a couple of days, trying to get folks housed. And I was just like, there's got to be a better way to do this. There's got to be a safer way. It certainly wasn't a waste of resources because people got the safety that they needed. But we were not prepared. And that was disappointing to experience.
Charles, what interested in your reaction as you see these impacts of these communities from these Labor Day fires?
Sure. And I would share Katrina's sentiments 100%. But watching the film and looking at the families impacted directly, once again, it's like someone standing on your stomach, and you ask yourself, what can I do? And you come back to immediately, well, can we prevent it? And we know fire can't be prevented 100%. And then it becomes a matter of how do we mitigate the impact on families and the environment? And that's where I end up. How do we lessen the impact of these tragedies? When you see a senior in high school, looking very sternly and resolutely at a camera and saying, every little bit of hope helps. And she's talking about getting blankets for her family, and she's talking about her father losing his tools and her mother losing everything. And she's standing there basically in a circumstance where they've lost their shelter. And you have to think about that in the Portland area and outside of the direct burn areas. People were complaining, and I don't mean this with any disrespect, but people were talking about smoke and the inconvenience of smoke, whereas there are families, Phoenix, Talent, Detroit, Gates, everything was lost. And those of us who are experiencing the smoke side of it, it's a serious consideration as well. But when you think about losing everything, and particularly the teacher who said, I'm homeless teaching homeless kids, and she starts crying, and you think about that and you say, that's serious devastation. And this wildfire response council process, the findings, the objectives, how do we mitigate the impact of wildfire knowing that we are going to experience it is really the issue. And how do we preserve and protect life and preserve and protect property? So for me, it's a continuation of seeing that in reality, feeling someone standing on your stomach, because that's the sense I got from watching that video, and then coming to a point of we have the opportunity to take steps to implement change that will result in a safer forest circumstance, a safer circumstance for families, protecting property, protecting their lives. So for me, it comes back to solutions, and Matt, that's why we're here. And we fortunately have a lot of people committed to finding those solutions and working together. So I'm looking forward to continuing this process in the summit.
And I would add to that, and I think all three of us had the benefit of hearing testimony on the Wildfire Council before the Labor Day fires. Not just here in Oregon, but, we heard the stories down in Paradise, California, and the communities impacted down there. And as we've done this work and pulled together these recommendations, you come face to face with these communities that are really impacted. And it's hard to really put yourself in their shoes, but they are really speaking with such urgency for help, and for policies that work, for the level of investment that we need, not just in bad fire years like after 2020, but year in and year out, because it's just a matter of time before these events hit. And I'm sure you both remember, just how that was really an animating theme for the Wildfire Council, is that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We've entered this era where we're going to be having these types of events, and we have to protect our communities.
Yeah, I just wanted to really appreciate what Charles said and saying and reminding us that there are solutions. And in times like these, when we see the impact to folks and hear about the impact of folks, thinking about the video itself and this summit, I really hope that folks walk away with a sense that there are things that we can do. And if we turn our attention and our focus to getting those solutions done and preparing for them and doing what it takes to implement them, things can get better. I felt a wave of hope when Charles said that.
Well, and I appreciate that, Katrina. And from my perspective, when you see the smoke in Portland and other areas that have not been directly hit by fire, you get a better sense, a deeper sense of what it really means. And I would hope that everyone could somehow see the video clips of towns like Phoenix, Talent, Detroit, and Gates that have been burned to the ground. And it may be away from you, but it affects all of us. And when you get the sense of how it affects a family directly, you have a deeper appreciation for the issue we're trying to address. And I would just hope everyone could somehow see that and hear it and feel the emotion attached to those families and those people who are affected by the fire directly, and take steps to help find a solution and work towards the solutions that we're talking about.
The impacts of wildfire are so vast, and it was really impressive to see the way people did join in, and it was very solutions oriented in an era that I think folks would agree is increasingly partisan. This was a really nonpartisan effort. I think, it was kind of Oregon operating at its best, which brings to mind that as we do transition over to our co-hosts, just to remind our audience how we organize, given the vastness of wildfire in our communities and the impacts. We broke things down into 4 kind of sub elements within our communities. One was building a safe power grid, transmission lines. Number 2 was building equitable and fair health systems, recognizing the impacts of smoke in particular, but also risks to our water supplies from mudslides and the like. The third was designing our communities with wildfire in mind, whether it was zoning or building codes and building materials, defensible space, which means how do we keep fuel loads away from our homes and so forth. And then finally, disaster recovery. So we pulled together recommendations in these 4 areas, but one theme that cut through all 4 areas is the theme of social justice, which wildfire, just like all matters related to climate change, ultimately impacts our most vulnerable communities the hardest. And with that, I think we'll transition over to our guests. Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm Matt Donegan, chair with the Wildfire Council, again joined by my fellow council members, Katrina, Holland, and Charles Wilhoite. And we are fortunate to have four leaders here in the state who are both elected leaders who represent their communities, but also members of the Wildfire Councils. These are folks that bring a real wealth of experience in the policy arena on wildfire, but also representing their communities. And I know we're very, very fortunate and happy to have everyone. And just I would introduce everyone to one another, but I know you all know one another. So thanks again. So I will ask if we could just ask our panelists to please maybe introduce yourselves to the audience and just give a little brief background. We'll maybe do this alphabetically. So maybe start with Commissioner Bennett.
Thank you. And it's really exciting to be a part of this since wildfires are a threat to Eastern Oregon, where I represent from Baker County to the west side. And it's a threat that we're all experiencing. And I believe that we're on really kind of one of the pillars for Oregon as we move ahead here right now. As Chairman Donegan mentioned, I'm a member of the Wildfire Council. I represent the Association of Oregon Counties and also the Eastern Oregon Counties Association. My background is I have over 30 years in experience in law enforcement. I retired as the Deputy Chief of Law Enforcement Operations for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. I've served as a Major Incident Commander in California and now with the COVID incident here in Oregon. My time in Baker County, I've served as the Emergency Management Director of Land Use Planning. I've been a Baker County Commissioner for 8 years. My wife and I are ranchers in Eastern Oregon. In the past 5 years, we've experienced on our range and timberlands over 3 major fires. And it's been a significant impact to the habitat, to the watersheds, and to the communities with both the direct with fire evacuations, loss of homes, and also with smoke to our communities. I'm looking forward to this. I really believe that this is an opportunity and a pivotal opportunity for us to make a difference in Oregon.
Thanks, Commissioner Bennett. Senator Findley, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chair Donegan. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a native Oregonian. I live in Eastern Oregon, where I was born and raised. I spent 32 years with the Bureau of Land Management and Wildland Fire Management. I've done nothing but fire most of my career, and it's just been an amazing pleasure to do so. I currently serve in the Oregon State Senate, representing 36% of the state of Oregon landmass, Southeast Oregon, and the swath from Deschutes to Wasco and Jefferson counties. And I serve on the Energy Environment Committee, Budget Committee. It was my pleasure and honor to serve on the Wildfire Council. In my federal career, I was a fire management officer in several different districts. I retired as a senior aviation manager for the Bureau. I went through the National Fire Plan in 2001 as the Department of Interior's technical representative. I've been engaged in this process. I've led and participated in national fire reviews, state fire reviews, major accident incident reviews. And this is just an honor to be here, and I represent it. This is a critical issue for a lot of folks, and it's very impactful when it impacts them. And so I'm a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, we appreciate your leadership very much, Senator. Representative Marsh, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here with all these colleagues. I'm Pam Marsh. I am the state representative from Southern Jackson County. And I've lived in Southern Oregon. I was just counting up about 26, 27 years. I've owned a business up in the woods all that time. So we've always been aware of the danger of fire. But then 2 years ago, in 2018, my district suffered through 6 weeks of choking smoke, and the existential crisis that posed all of a sudden made fire front and center for all of us. And then at that point, I joined the Wildfire Council, was pleased to serve. And then came 2020. And in 2020, the Alameda fire swept through the heart of my district, destroying the homes of 2,500 families, destroying hundreds of businesses. And so now fire and the likelihood of an urban wildfire is really front and center in front of us. So this work is absolutely critical.
Well, I want to say thank you on behalf of everybody for all your leadership, Representative Marsh, and thank you for joining us. And also Mayor Russell from the city of Bend. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's such a pleasure to be here today and be at this table and to see all of you again. I haven't seen a lot of you since the Wildfire Response Council meeting Katrina for the first time. And so I was born and raised in Oregon, moved to Bend in the early 80s. You know, I was on the Planning Commission, I was thinking in the 1990s. And I was thinking this morning as I got up, every morning I walk through the fire burn of the Aubrey Hall fire. If that started in 1990, it was a campfire on the edge of town in a park that had been left. Wind came up, blew it right across the western edge of Bend, took out a lot of homes, jumped the Deschutes River, and they finally caught it. And I was up in the mountains hiking. We got stuck up there a couple days because all the roads were closed and we couldn't go anywhere. So we just camped out a couple more days. But I could never have understood then what we experienced in 2017, 2018, 2020. And I'm so grateful that this work that the Wildfire Response Council has done, building on the experience and work of so many others before us, and that we're taking this forward to the next level and the next step with the legislature here in Oregon. This is so important. So I look forward to our conversations today.
Thanks again for joining us, Mayor Russell. And again, thank you to all of our panelists. Representative Marsh, I'd like to start by asking you you mentioned your background in Southern Oregon. Southern Oregon is such a focal point of wildfire activity. And, you know, one thing that you heard from all of our panelists in the introductions was just obviously 2020, but kind of this longer term, history with wildfire in your communities. Maybe just start by talking about what does wildfire mean in your community, to your community, and maybe some of the experiences that you might be able to share with us.
Well, I would say wildfire became a very real thing starting about 2 years ago, again, when we had that summer of smoke. After that 6 weeks, and that was a period in which people really thought deeply about whether they could continue to live in the community, whether they could continue to do work in a community that has a tourist orientation at a time when deep smoke was choking us on a daily basis. And at the end of that summer, I realized we needed to come together and talk about it. And I held an event at Southern Oregon University, and 400 people showed up and spent a full Saturday morning really trying to understand what we needed to do in our forests, trying to understand the economic consequences, the health consequences, and the role that climate change plays in exacerbating the conditions on the ground. So that was 2018. Again, in 2020, this became a very different thing when we had an urban fire sweep through the community, a fire that did not consume a single acre of forest, and put a whole new reality on it. And all of a sudden, we were looking much more than we had before at issues like emergency notification systems, which failed in the case of our Alameda fire, evacuation issues, defensive space, how do we build back urban landscaping. The 2020 fires, and to be clear, we are only starting the tiny steps toward recovery, have really put a whole new set of issues front and center for us. And clearly, in order for us to be as protected as we can be, we have to do everything that's in front of us. We have to build emergency systems, we have to do defensive space, and we have to do smart work in the forests that surround our community. Because although our fire didn't implicate the forest, that certainly wasn't the case for other fires in 2020, and we know won't be the case for fires in the future. So we have a big agenda in front of us, and I think my community is very focused on the work that has to come ahead of us.
Yeah, if I might ask you as well, Representative Marsh, first of all, thank you for joining us. I want to thank all of you for joining us today and for being so committed to this issue. Uh, you and your colleagues are under significant pressure every day because there are demands in our state for a lot of different things. We're dealing with a lot of social unrest, and we're dealing with a housing crisis, and you serve on the Housing Committee. What approach do you take when wildfire is the issue when you're talking with your colleagues? I'm just curious how you have the conversation since there are so many, demanding forces for limited resources. What approach do you take?
Well, I think as a legislature, our challenge during this session is really to be very focused on what our priorities are. And that includes responding to the pandemic because we're still trying to work our way out of that. It includes looking at racial justice issues and includes housing, and wildfire is very clearly one of the priorities in front of us. I think my job as a legislator is to continue to remind my colleagues of what happened last summer and what is still happening on the ground in my community. It's an easy story for me to tell because every day I get emails from people who are in deep grief and still experiencing the trauma of that situation. So making it real for people is an important part of the job. And to this point, I think that we have the attention of the legislature as we move forward.
Representative Marsh, I want to thank you for your time on the Wildfire Council and for your representation of your district. We had the opportunity of working together in many different facets, but sort of a follow-up question that I'm wondering about is for folks who may not understand the implications on housing and the pressures that wildfire faces, not just in terms of damage, but also in terms of if we don't mitigate, we create a bigger situation. Could you take a few minutes to just describe that a little bit?
Well, let me just describe our experience in 2020. The Alameda fire, which again was an urban wildfire, took out 2,500 homes. To be clear, it's terrible to lose your home under any circumstances, but a disproportionate share of the homes that were destroyed were homes to our most vulnerable populations. We lost, of those 2,500 homes, about 1,500 to 1,700 manufactured homes and RVs in which people were living. That housing was the home to our seniors, our working people, our farm workers, our Latinx population. I mean, we know that climate change is going to have a disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations. And if you had any doubt of that, look what happened in the Alameda fire, because those are the folks who lost their homes. So now as we strive to recover from that, it's a hard situation for people who have brick and mortar homes, but most of them are, virtually all of them have some insurance policies. People who lived in manufactured homes, we can't recreate that housing. That was our naturally occurring affordable housing. It was $20,000 manufactured homes. You can't buy $20,000 manufactured homes. So what is called for here is a deep public and philanthropic investment in recreating housing on the ground to get people back into the communities. So it's a tremendous task in front of us, and it's really going to demand that we all come together and put a direct focus on recreating that housing. And just one more thought, that's in the context of a community that was already beset by housing shortages before we ever had a wildfire. We now have a vacancy rate of less than 1%. So there is literally no place for people who have been displaced to go. And that's part of the job. It's building back long-term housing, but it's also figuring out where people are going to be for the next 2, 3, 4 years while the community rebounds.
Well, I will just say I have the privilege, of serving on the Oregon Housing Stability Council. And you just hit a point that I was going to press on. We had a crisis before the wildfires hit. And I also have the joy and privilege of sitting at Meyer Memorial Trust. And when the fires hit, Oregon Community Foundation, other foundations, they really rallied. And my comments at that Oregon Housing Stability Council are always centered on this has to be a joint and collaborative effort among private foundations, private individuals, and the government. And I'm so happy to hear you say that, because that's the only way we're going to be able to address this housing crisis that we're still in the middle of.
Representative Marsh said it so perfectly. The impacts of wildfire sort of compound on one another, right? Especially in the housing market. So you had a crisis to begin with. You have a fire that rips out homes that people were living in. Those people now are houseless in a vacancy rate that is significantly lower than historical times. There's nowhere for them to go. So there's immense time limited pressure on us as a community to recover so that folks can participate, which creates more tension in the market, which creates higher prices, which makes it less affordable. And so it just keeps compounding over and over and over again. And so, yeah, I thank you for your work on that. And hopefully we can figure out how to get out of this mess.
So I've got a couple questions, and Representative Marsh, I'm going to just confess on the front end, these are vexing questions I'm about to ask. Now, they're not easy. These were some of the more difficult questions that we faced when we were on the Wildfire Council. The one starts with just, in the context of creating fire-adapted communities, creating a fire-adapted power grid, transmission grid, and safe and reliable electricity for our communities, and in particular, our most vulnerable communities. And some of the most emotional testimony that we heard on the Wildfire Council was from folks talking about de-energization and proactive blackouts and what the impacts to communities are going to be, rural communities and so forth. And can you just help the audience think about, how do we thread the needle between creating safe, conditions for our communities, and at the same time, recognizing, the importance of reliable power to these same communities, and how do we move forward on that?
The more our communities have their own sources of power or have access to renewable sources that can continue on a microgrid or neighborhood basis, the more protected we will be from the need to take action on the larger power grid. So we are working hard in this legislative session on some measures that would really inspire and support the development of more renewable energy within our communities. I think you have to come at it from both directions. Good policy on the state level and also a lot of support on the local level so that we have a little bit more independence and resilience in the case of not only wildfire emergencies, but the other kinds of natural disasters that could come our way.
Is there a federal role here? I mean, there's so much emphasis on infrastructure.
Well, as we start to integrate more renewables into the grid too, we'll be looking at transmission systems between and among states. So there's a lot of big integrated issues that have to be addressed as we look at the power grids and how we support communities in the case of disaster. And I think that there's definitely a role for the feds because that's where the real money is. So I'm hoping, and many of us are, that the infrastructure package that's coming forward will provide a good deal of support for much more of this energy alternative work.
So the last thing on the grid there, Representative Marsh, is that one of the real vexing problems is that so much of the capital that comes from making upgrades to the grid just gets passed on to ratepayers. And that's generally how this is done. If you're not careful, that can create a regressive tax, and we can be putting these upgrades as capitalization right on the backs of these same low-income, vulnerable communities that are most disproportionately hit by climate change. How do we approach that issue from a social justice perspective?
Well, I think we can do a couple of things. One is we are passing legislation, I hope, during this session. It's passed the House that will allow the Public Utility Commission to implement low-income affordable rates for Oregonians who qualify from an income perspective. So that's a big step forward. And then I think we have to take a step back and understand the importance of public investment in developing energy alternatives. Because you're right, if we do nothing, then the weight of integrating renewables into the system is entirely on the back of the ratepayers. And there's a role for government investment there to make sure that we are supporting projects so that they make sense, that they pencil out, and that we are providing a different source of capital so that all of the weight of that doesn't fall on ratepayers. And I think we as a state need to take a deep look at that.
Representative Marsh had to step away to join the floor session that's in process with the House. So thank you to Representative Marsh. Mary Russell, I'd like to turn to Central Oregon now. We've heard from Representative Marsh about Southern Oregon. When you look at the wildfire risk maps that are out there on the internet, you see these bright red regions, and Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon, Hood River. But among the biggest and reddest is Central Oregon. And I know this has become a big part of the job description now to be the mayor of Bend, is to really be the leader through these fire events and preparing the community. And I wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit about what wildfire has meant for you on the job as you've been mayor, and some of the success stories that you've seen, and some of the other ways that wildfire has affected your community.
So I think living in Bend, wildfire has always been a part of the landscape. We'd have a thunderstorm, you'd look in the mountains, you'd see the smoke plumes go up, and you'd see, an airplane fly over and put it out. We were up in the mountains, they'd fly over the lake, scoop up the water, put it on the fire. But it was something that we always sort of assumed was going to be manageable and containable. And maybe once in a while it would be a little less so. But one of the things that I was thinking about, again, right now we're dealing with a massive change. Our state, our country, our world is dealing with this massive change, climate change, global warming in so many facets. And I think the biggest opportunity for us, whether or not it's with COVID or wildfire or whatever it looks like, is for us to understand that the status quo is no longer even remotely viable or healthy or wise. So in living with wildfire in preparation for our meeting today, I started thinking about all the major fires have been occurring. And so in 2014, our exchange student was getting ready for graduation, and my daughters were getting ready for finals on a high school that's on the west side of the city. And we had the Two Bowls fire that literally the fire erupted as we were going to Martine's graduation. And we thought, oh, it'll be fine. It'll be out by the time we're out of graduation 2 hours later. And it was a fire, again, that was running across the land. It was headed straight at our water treatment facility that serves, 50 to 100% of our community, depending on the time of year. It was nipping along the edges right where the girls' high school was. This became a reality. And then there was the smoke. So we shut down the schools. The girls never, Martine graduated. That was the last high school event. Everything changed in that moment for our community. The vulnerability of our communities in terms of clean air, the ability for us to do business as we'd always expected within our community, attracting people to our natural forest lands, and really reteaching them of what it's like to be safe. In terms of how they manage their fires in that area, as well as, getting out in case and looking for those signs, right? Everything in our universe has changed. So I became chair of the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project about 6 years ago. And, what we're really focusing on is how do we work on our forests to be them healthy and resilient as much as we can create for this recreation area that's important to our economy and the lifestyle of our community? How we make sure that the animals that live there are healthy, and the trees and the entire environment that takes place there is as close to a natural and sustainable landscape as it possibly can be. So, and then how do we work with fire, both in applying it through prescribed fire across the landscape very carefully, and how do we then work with our firefighters in the event that we have a fire that takes place in our community? These are all relatively new and fresh conversations that we've talked about in one way or another. Our world has changed, and we have to adapt how we adapt our lifestyles, how we look at funding, how we prioritize, how we reuse our facilities, whether or not they're schools, how we rework our notification systems to make sure that people get out safely, and how we work with teams to address these fires when they get going to minimize the impact on any of our communities throughout the state.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Charles and Katrina to into some follow-up questions. But before I do, I just want to make sure that we go around to all the panelists and give everybody an opportunity to kind of. So I'm going to turn next to Senator Findley and next finally to Commissioner Bennett. I'm going to offer you, Senator, to talk in your own voice about this issue, whether. And you of all of us, and I think, Commissioner Bennett as well, but you're wearing a couple hats here. On one hand, you're representing your community and you're representing your neighbors. Feel free to speak on behalf of your neighbors and what wildfire has meant to ranchers and folks in town. And then also you're wearing the hat of being a bona fide expert here and can speak with a lot of authority about what do we need to do.
Well, thanks, Matt. I'll tell you, I've been taking notes as we go through and all these great little pivot points I'd like to speak about. But probably the most important thing is a long time ago in the mid-'80s, the Forest Service put out a presentation that referenced back to Gifford Pinchot days about a healthy forest and a healthy landscape. And that really hit home with me. I was able to take some fire effects and fire behavior courses through the University of Washington. We went out into each side of the Cascades and did a fire history study. Fire's been a natural part of our ecosystem forever. And we have to embrace that and utilize that. The things that have changed is our interaction with them. I think probably if I could say there's one thing that would stop or not stop, it would reduce the impacts of wildfire, would be a healthy landscape. If we had a healthy ecosystem, a healthy forest, a healthy rangeland, we would reduce our fires somewhat. But and then I've seen graphs when you look at when fires really started getting big. Well, I can go back and show big fires well before that. But probably one of the biggest single factors is it used to have, when we had a healthy landscape and we were actively managing our forest, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the forest every day. And if there were a fire started, all those people would stop whatever they're doing and immediately went to the fire. I'm thinking back in 1986, I was working in the Portland Coordination Center, and there were fires all over the landscape in western and eastern Oregon. There's a new fire started on the Willamette National Forest by Oak Ridge. And within an hour and a half, there were 250 private individuals on that fire, and they caught the fire within an hour. So those resources are no longer there. And so we've lost a large part of our initial attack capability, and that's the private industry being there. So we're relying on government to do that. And that makes it difficult. We have to figure out how to have adaptive management and adequately manage this as we grow these communities into the urban interface. And I was in the room years ago when the term WUI first came up. And it is a huge thing, something that we cannot overlook. I mean, as we encroach further into the wildlands, because it's a nice and it's a great place to be, we're doing a fuel type conversion. We're going from natural fuels to man-made fuels. And we're not doing a very good job of that in the protection and in the interface and the resiliency from around that. So I think it's critical that we do that kind of thing. When you look at fire history, the huge pine stands in eastern Oregon have all burned, and they thrive on fire. They only reproduce with fire. So we have to figure out how we can continue that. And some of it's going to require some things that aren't very, very fun. When you drive down the Santiam Canyon right now, which I do every 2 weeks when I'm traveling back and forth to eastern Oregon, and you see log deck out, mile after mile of burn scar, hazard tree removal, and decks of logs all over the place. Well, had that forest been managed a little better and worked on, probably wouldn't have had quite the fire problem that we had. And instead of having these huge scars on the hillside and log decks, it would probably be a much more natural state. So we got to rethink about the whole thing. I mean, clearly we have changing in the fuel type. Clearly we have warming of the atmosphere and climate change. But a lot of that is amplified by the fact that we're also moving into the woods. We're removing our initial attack capability, and we're not doing near the job we need to do in protecting a healthy landscape. So
this is an opportunity for you to talk about for your communities, this kind of restoration work that you're talking about. Is actually, a positive, point on social justice where we can create, family wage jobs. We can create rural revitalization. We can put people to work. And so this is an opportunity to address social justice through economic development in your community. So maybe give you an opportunity to speak to that a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, you look through Eastern Oregon and all over Eastern Oregon, fire has impacted those communities, with large fires around them. It's reduced the available workload, and the workforce is changing. I mean, we should go back in Grant County and Baker County and in Wheeler County, all of those areas that have had large fires in the last few years. There's a lot of work to be done in there to be living wage jobs. The problem is we have some of that. We've lost the market. We've lost the ability to deal with those residual fuels. I mean, the work afterwards, the Canyon Creek fire in Grant County of 3 years ago, which burned the entire watershed on the slope above John Day, is, they're still rebuilding the roadways and the homes. There's still houses that haven't been rebuilt. There's a lot of work that we can and should be doing there, which we should be doing it smartly. But, the employment opportunities are high. Sometimes we get in our own way with providing too much red tape to pull that off. Building codes. I talked with a guy that lost his home in the San Diego Canyon fire. He was lucky enough to be in a position where he had good insurance, he had resources. He's still not turned a spade to restart rebuilding. And that's sad. So we got to figure out how to do it smarter than we are.
Well, thank you, Senator, very, very much. And we'll finally turn to Commissioner Bennett. Thanks for being so patient, Mark. I know you got a lot to say on this topic. And then we'll kind of open it up to a little bit more kind of Q&A and ask, particularly ask Charles and Katrina to kind of get engaged. So you're wearing a couple of hats here. You're a county commissioner. You represent your community, but you've got a lot of real bona fide experience here. And so you bring and also, in other neighboring states in California. So you bring a very rich, background in terms of the impact to these, to our communities, but also how do we adapt? How do our communities adapt to this era of increased wildfires?
First of all, in the introduction, as I've sat here and reflected a moment, I think something that really needs to be just instilled in all Oregonians is complacency. We had the Paradise Fire in California, and we all were, excuse the term, fired up about it. And we had the Wildfire Council, and then we had a real wet winter, wet spring, and there was other priorities. And there will always be other priorities. However, this is one that's been with us for a long time and will continue. And, it just is one that's really near and dear to my heart, having experienced fires on our ranches, having been as a commissioner when there weren't enough firefighters. I served 3 days as a heavy equipment team leader. Senator Findley's statement about the lacking of experience out in the woods. There were logging companies that were here that come over that said, we don't have anybody to staff our cats or crew our cats, dozers. The Forest Service and the other federal and state agencies, by not doing work in the woods, did not have enough experienced team leaders. And so they were reaching out, and we just couldn't. A lot of times you would come to the staging area and there'd be a line of dozers, a line of feller bunchers, a line of other equipment, because there just wasn't adequate staff to go with them. And, for hours they wouldn't be deployed. And so I think that, we really need to consider that workforce pool, that workforce development. In looking at Eastern Oregon, the average is 27% of our student population is on free and reduced lunches. and over 30% of our population is under the poverty level. So that's important. So when we talk about equity, it stretches all across Oregon. It stretches all across. And it doesn't mean that any one group on the east side should take priority. That isn't my point. It's just that we need to keep it all together there. You know, one of the things that's really critical, I believe, is that getting a partnership together of homeowners, starting at homeowners. We often as government, and I can speak to Baker County because while I was planning director and commissioner, we adopted, and we're a conservative county, by the way, we adopted fire siting safety standards and fire-wise communities also. We adopted access, as Senator Findley mentioned or discussed. One of the things that's so important is not only do you need to get fire apparatus in, but you need to have a way for the people to escape while the fire is coming. And 12-foot roads won't do it. And 12-foot roads will not be a buffer, and the firefighters can't get in. We also raised our requirement that houses and would require a 50,000-pound bridge or culverts, whatever, for stream crossing, because the apparatus couldn't get in, the water tenders couldn't get in with just a couple of railroad ties and some boards thrown over it, because we can't ask our firefighters to put themselves on the line and defend it. But if we don't start out at that first very level of getting the homeowner engaged, and not with a stick, but with ownership that it's all going to be there. There are not going to be enough firefighters to protect all the residences and all of the lives out there. It's just not practical. We also adopted fire siting safety standards, the Oregon Department of Forestry, the old Senate Bill 360 standards, and along with that, hardened homes. And I firmly believe that if in a small rural county that's very conservative can adopt it, that if you take it out and take the package out, then you would be able to, in fact, get it in some of more urban counties that would join on there. So I'm very optimistic about that. And that was one of the outgrowths that I believe that was real positive of the Wildfire Council. One of the things that's important is we need to have local government in that partnership. And this can't be any one facet. It can't be just the state of Oregon, or it can't be city of Bend or the county of Baker. We all need to be together there. But this will not occur long term if we don't engage the citizens too, because also you have the smoke issue. In the valley that I live, the average age is 67 years old, and inversion layers come in even from prescribed burns or wildfire, and it just sits here, and the folks are just pretty much trapped. They really don't have any other place to go. So we need to take a look at how are we going to deal with that. We need prescribed fire. That's obvious, and we will have wildfire. So how are we going to address the issues of the health issues from the smoke? And that's, it's going to be a heavy lift and a long conversation, but it has, the outcome will be very positive.
Well, I would love the opportunity to direct a question to Senator Findley. 32 years with the BLM, you represent, as you stated, 36% of the land mass of Oregon. You have fire expertise. What frustrates you the most about where we are as a state, and how do you push people to move us in a position of being better able to deal with natural wildfire and creating these resilient landscapes that will protect people and property?
Well, thanks, Charles. I think probably the largest is the complacency and believing that it's someone else's responsibility to deal with it. As Commissioner Bennett stated, it starts with the local landowner, and it takes a village to do this. And people think, well, this will never happen to me, and I don't think I need to deal with this fuels issue. I don't think I need to deal with this forest health issue. And that's not true. I mean, it takes everyone to do this, and until the Eagle Creek fire on the Columbia River, people in Portland didn't have a lot of respect for fire. Then they did for a couple of years, Now they don't because it's 3 years ago. So I think that's probably the complacency, and it takes everyone's involved. We can't wait for the federal government or the state government to come in and swoop in and fix it. It's a problem we all have to start from the ground up.
Thanks.
I'd like to do a follow-up question to Senator Findley. I've been asking this of each legislator who comes on this summit so far. It feels like, to your point earlier about sort of relying on others to solve the problem for us, what in the legislature, what would you say is sort of the temperature or the interest in trying to deal with this at a systemic level? And let me be fully clear. Like, I understand that we are facing one of the biggest budget deficits that Oregon has seen in many, many years in the next 10 years. But I am sort of curious to know, like, where are your colleagues on this?
Well, thank you, Katrina. I will tell you, I serve on the emergency board, so that means we deal, when the legislature is not in session, the E-board deals with emerging budgetary issues. We met 13 times as an emergency board between June 30th of last year and January 15th of this year. Record number of times. There is a tremendous amount of support from all of my colleagues on doing the right thing. And at no point in time did we can't afford to come up. I mean, in regards to we needed to pay for the firefighting costs. We needed to pay for some of the starting of the recovery costs. We've made some incredibly innovative steps to start doing that. ODOT's leading a $600 million project to clean up some of these sites, these burn sites, including private properties. And we've done some incredible things, and not once have we ever talked, we can't afford to do this. I think this is the right thing for Oregon to do, the right thing for the communities to do, and we're going to do it.
In terms of follow-up there, Katrina, I think it's a great question. And it reminds me, that, Senator Lou Frederick spoke to this exact issue, I think, very, very well during the council deliberations. And I think and I do think the Portland area is ready to stand with the rest of the state and do what it takes. And I think partly what's incumbent upon us is to tell the story and to reach the audiences, in the urban areas, because wildfire isn't, top of mind year in and year out the way it is on the rural communities. And I think to the extent we can tell that story and really connect urban populations with their neighbors out in the rural communities, that will hopefully sustain the investment that Senator Findley's talking about.
Fire is indiscriminate. It does not care if your home is Republican or Democratic. It doesn't care. It will burn you if you're in the path. And as I was saying, you've lived through it personally. I think there's probably some misconception about Bend as far as Bend is fine, Bend has money, Bend is always protected. Could you share with us your population? And you touched on it earlier. We have working people in Bend. We have people of different races and religions. It's a diverse area in some, but not all regards. Can you just touch on that so people have a better perspective on what we're talking about protecting, whether it's Eastern Oregon, Southern Oregon, Central Oregon? Can you share that with us from Bend's perspective?
We've had a lot of conversations. I'm going to go sort of pivot a little bit on your question, because the question is sort of working proactively versus reactively, and where do you invest your dollars? And a lot of the work that we've been trying to do on the west side of Bend, where we probably have the biggest risk of wildfire running into our community, and in truth, it is certainly nibbled around the edges and come in a couple times. We do find that when we put prescribed fire down after the thinning, which does have an economic component to it. So, and then the masticating or the chewing up of materials. And then if we put fire down, it actually makes it a more ecologically resilient environment, as well as a more fire resilient and resistant environment. But we have huge issues in terms of every once in a while we'll have an inversion that will bring the smoke back into our community for anywhere between 4 and 12 hours. And so we have developed a communication system with our health providers throughout our entire region, so that if we see that, so number one, we tell everybody who has that health issue through a communication system is like, this may happen. So there's a heads up piece, right? And we have those people, we have the ability to reach those parts of our community that are at risk. And then we have identified the facilities and the systems and the resources that those people will need should this happen. Ironically, that's turned out to be really useful as we've had these larger and larger sort of wildfire smoke events take place in our community. The other thing that I haven't had a chance to mention, but I think is really important, is there are a lot of great collaborative models about actually reducing fire loads on the edge and within communities. I was thinking of Project Wildfire. I attend events in our neighborhoods, inside our community as well on the edges of our community. It's through a program called Fire Free. Basically, they'll collect the materials and take them to the dump for the community. So they provide the labor and we haul it away for them. I mean, there are ways for us as a community to work together to make those areas which have a lot of fire fuel, we partner, and it's not nearly as expensive as some other systems, but it's in terms of getting work done on a timely basis, getting those people who are invested and who want to do something to do that. And I feel like that's a huge opportunity for our state and our communities to continue to look at and invest in. That's going to make, in terms of safety and just reducing risk, our biggest opportunity is reducing risk. It's so much less expensive to reduce risk than it is to put these huge firefighting capacity on, right? But we've got to invest to get to that place.
Commissioner Bennett, talk about a little bit about one of the major elements of the council's recommendations is to really think about how we design our communities that are in the wildland-urban interface. And that's everything from zoning, how much should we be building in fire-prone areas, to what kind of building materials should we be using, even more complicated for the existing structures, many of which were built in another era without fire-wise design and so forth. And then also managing defensible space. Start getting into, multiple complex questions around economic development. We want to use land to revitalize these communities. Private property rights versus, state expectations, community expectations, neighbors' expectations of one another. Who's going to pay for all this? Because a lot of this is going to, impact low income or vulnerable communities. How are they going to afford all this? So maybe you could kind of speak from a rural county's perspective, a county that cares about wildfire, cares about its safety, but also has these other considerations.
I think first and foremost, as the representative of the Association of Oregon Counties and the Eastern Oregon counties believe that it's critical that it isn't developed as a one-size-fits-all template, and that counties working within a region develop the standards that are appropriate for their people, and that they're heavily engaged in that discussion, whether it's the wildfire risk maps or whether it's insurance risk maps, building codes, etc. There is a broad support that and recognition. The Association of Oregon Counties planning directors are working on templates for land use zoning and land use requirements. But when you start having the discussion about limiting buildings, then as you alluded to, then we start into the private property rights area. And then we start to lose that momentum where we can all find commonality and working together. So we kind of need to always be really sensitive, like, let's work to those areas that we can accomplish things in versus blocking or getting into discussions where we're going to just get loggerheads, and my colleague counties will, and perhaps my county also would say, we're not going to participate any longer. And then we get into some of those real divisive type discussions. All of the counties agree that we need to do work. We need to have, as you know, the senator mentioned and I mentioned also, about that we need to have adequate access, that we do need defensible space, that we do need to develop WUIs that are important. WUI, or the Wildland Urban Interface, so I don't just throw out acronyms. When it first came out, it was a product of the FireWise program, and counties, fire districts, the agencies kind of looked at it as, how can we draw it best to get the most money? I mean, quite frankly, that's the way it was. I participated into it, and that's what we did. Now we've gone back and we've looked at it in a more surgical fashion, and we've looked at it in a more appropriate fashion of, let's clearly identify those areas, and we need to do work in those areas. There is a lot of support for doing work in those areas. And once again, it has to be a partnership. It has to be a partnership with not only the government agencies, but the homeowners. Because one of the largest things is, and I can speak to Baker County, we have all of these requirements, but we don't have the funding to ever go out and make an inspection. So the people do it. We make an inspection. They get their building permit. They get their occupancy permit. But 5 years later, the trees have grown back up. They've piled other wood under the deck, etc. And it's kind of back to square one. So we need that partnership with the insurance industry, with the county, the city, with the fire agencies.
If you could kind of think about 10, 15 years from now, and if you were to paint a vision for what fire-adapted communities mean in your community, and what some of the key elements of that would be, including partnership between urban and rural communities, including sustainable economies, including, having worked through this backlog of excess vegetation and so forth. But whatever that vision might mean for your community.
I believe that what we will see for a good, positive community is that there are standards developed, adopted, bought into by all parties, that it will be a carrot and stick, that we'll have worked with our insurance companies and they will offer a lot of the carrots, and unfortunately they also have a stick, that this partnership will grow where the fire agencies are bought in and that they understand, and that it isn't just totally left to the planning department's desk, whether it be in the city or the county, that we have adequate roads, that we have adequate water supply, that we have a realization that this is going to be an ongoing thing, and that complacency will be really the dangerous piece. And I echo what the senator said and what I said initially, that it's complacency. I keep looking at that Paradise Fire in California and how much we talked about it at the Wildfire Council. And then we went into that, and there will always be competing priorities at the legislature. There will always be competing priorities at the courthouse. But if we all take our responsibility, and I say that from whether it be a rancher in Eastern Oregon or somebody that lives in Bandon, we all have a responsibility. And if we do our small part, then the whole thing will come together in a synergistic type of approach.
Okay, last thing, Mark. I would offer you the opportunity to expand that vision into health systems, modernization, dealing with smoke events, and if you care to, even, a safe power grid. So if there's any other elements, beyond just kind of the WUI design, as you kind of think more broadly, and for that matter, even firefighting and even landscape management, but just, think a little bit more broadly beyond just the WUI design and some of those other key elements of what does a sustainable vision 15 years from now look like?
Well, obviously, first and foremost, we have to continue it. We just can't do all the fuels treatment and then go, well, that's good. This is an ongoing. The forest lands, the environment is always regenerating and reproducing. We need to keep working forward on that. So what we need to do is have good, adequate plans for de-energizing the lines so that our vulnerable populations, our biopic populations, all of them have, they're not just 5 days, 10 days without power sitting there. We need to address that. And that's going to be a government energy provider, homeowner type of an address. That's going to be really critical there.
Senator Findley, would you want to maybe take the next crack at painting a vision here for?
I do. A couple of things, transmission, grid, resiliency. Those are all things we're working on a big way in the legislature. I mean, the Energy Environment Committee, we have a resiliency bill about to roll out. We rolled out last week a regional transmission organization overview. Some of the things for resiliency is to figure out how to capitalize things, individual, put it to cells, so communities, critical infrastructure within communities can still maintain their services. And that's what we're trying to do. The resiliency has a pretty big program to try to disperse generation capabilities throughout the state, single out the grid and to to compartmentize some of that. Those are things that we have to work on, and we are. Now, we can start this, and we will start it. I think I believe it is a state responsibility to do, is to look at the opportunities for a regional transmission organization so we can segment parts of the state. Now, there's a federal role, but I think we got to get our stuff together in the state first, and then it's into the local communities as well. Drill on down into there. So how can we have emergency services? Russell made a very good point earlier about the HIPAA stuff. So if we can, all the HIPAA filters on a building won't work if the ventilation systems aren't working. So we have to ensure that we have that resilient manner in that so we can maintain a safe and healthy environment for people. And I think that's what we need to strive to do. And I believe we're starting on that path. We have a lot of work to do.
I'm going to go back to sort of one of the many themes I put forward, which is that this is a time of change. And I think this is also a time where every single person has to take on responsibility to take care of themselves as well as take care of their community and contribute to that. Because I feel as if, when I look at the people who leave unattended campfires out in the forest, when I look at the people who are making plans for upgrading the schools, when I look at the people who are responsible for emergency evacuation, I think we all, to a certain extent, are all still looking for somebody else to do it. But I think we as individuals also have to recognize the impact of our own responsibilities, the impact of our own decisions. And so for the people who participate in the Firewise, for those people who work on the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project, for those people who partner with the Red Cross to provide shelter for those people who are the most vulnerable, right? I mean, it's also about all of us recognizing the impact that we have. And it's also about, if you decide to live in the middle of a forest that traditionally has seen fire run through it on the east side, often in the Ponderosa Forest every 10 to 25 years, it's your responsibility to find a way to partner with your neighbors to reduce the fuels and to create fire breaks and be ready to work to make your place more defensible. Because honestly, our state is too big, and at the rate that fires are beginning to come up, just like this fire a couple weeks ago in Bend, there's not enough of everything that can ever suppress a fire in every single corner. So when you build a home to create defensible space, to have the materials that will keep it from catching on fire, when roof, siding, wood piles, and working with your neighbors to make sure that happens too. I mean, I think that's really, to a certain extent, we've kept thinking it's not going to happen to us. It's not going to happen here. It's not going to happen in our community. I don't need to take that into account. Because as a government, we will work to get messaging out. We will work to prepare people. We will find the money to invest as much as we possibly can, whether or not it's transmissions or getting the sheriff out to knock on your front doors or have emergency alerts on your phones that either lead you out of your home or into a place where you can breathe fresh air and get food and have a bed to spend the night. Right? I mean, it's all interlinked, but it's going to take our whole communities. You can't just turn your head and point to somebody else to doing that.
This is an individual responsibility. It has to start with the person you see in the mirror to pull this off. And if everybody looks at the mirror and says, this is the first step we're going to do in building a healthy landscape and building a resiliency community and providing all these things, that's the way it'll start. Not figuring that it's going to be your neighbor that does it. It has to start individually, and then think what we can accomplish if we all have the same goal in mind.
I'll just say briefly, thanks again for everything you're doing in the area of wildfire. I had the privilege of serving as a chair of the Nature Conservancy of Oregon for the past 2 years, and I have had an even greater privilege and joy of driving all over this state chasing fish, because I love to fish. I've driven to the Owyhee River and I've crossed, great fishing. And when you get to do that, and I say get to because it's a privilege, we live in an amazing state, you develop a different appreciation for what this state has to offer. And listening to you all and the other panelists that we've had and observing Matt's unwavering commitment to this issue, you can't help but come back to the point that it is all about the people, but it's also very much about our state, its beauty, the income that it generates in different ways. And you have to consider all of that. And I appreciate all of you are saying the same thing. This is a very complex issue. And I'm always happy to see steps in the right direction. And I'm looking at you again, Senator Findley. You've got a bill coming up on Monday, 762, on wildfire, the comprehensive wildfire package. Those are the kind of steps that we have to take, and that's the type of investment we have to make to preserve what we have in this state. And it starts with the people, but you cannot ignore the property side of it, and you cannot ignore the economic side of it. And all of that has to come to the picture, and that's why it requires private and public partnership. And I think we're all saying the same thing. So I will stop at that and say once again, thank you for all of your commitment and all the work you're doing to address this very significant issue.
Yeah, I'm feeling an immense sense of gratitude and thinking and hearing all of the work that y'all are doing and all of the issues, both personal and professional, that you're trying to address in a comprehensive manner. I can't imagine how difficult that must be. And so I just feel an immense sense of gratitude for taking the time to do the work and make us all safer and more resilient. It's greatly appreciated.
Wow, I think a fantastic panel. Such committed community leaders and also all council members. So very knowledgeable about this topic. Katrina, maybe ask you if, just your general synthesis, impressions, what does this leave you thinking about?
Well, again, coming from the housing industry, as I've said over and over, this has definitely been a big learning experience for me. And I can imagine that for folks who are probably watching this, there's a sense of overwhelm. Like, wow, there are so many things to think about when it comes to trying to address this issue, mitigation, recognize that it's not going to go away. So you do have to try to build resilience and the different elements that are all involved in doing that. And that's sort of where I'm sitting right now. It's just like, my goodness, this issue is so giant. So, I'm definitely just thankful for the leadership that all three of those elected officials are providing right now, and especially the reminder that even though there is a sense of overwhelm and thinking about how complicated and complex addressing these issues along the spectrum can be, knowing that I can do something with the resources that I have and the time that I have and the interests that I have also gives a sense of hope. I've really appreciated Senator Findley's reminder that, it starts with looking in the mirror, not looking next door, not looking over your shoulder to the neighbor, but actually looking at yourself and saying, what are the steps that I can take to make sure that I'm not causing a fire, going out and camping like Mayor Russell described, by making sure that I'm putting out my fire if I'm going camping, if the resources are available, doing what I can to make my own space resilient, and making defensible areas within my own home. It was volunteer folks and homeowners who actually rushed to the scene to put a fire out. That made me feel a lot of like, oh, okay, there is something that I can do. I can make a little small piece, contribute a little small piece. And I hope that those who are watching this, especially those who are like me in this learning space, can feel like involved and like there is something that we can do to do this and walk away with that sense of responsibility.
Katrina always does a wonderful job of summarizing and touching on all the relevant and significant points. But I will add, and I've stated this before, it doesn't matter what side of the line you're on. This is not a partisan issue. And that was the beauty of having, the Senator Findley with us, Representative Marsh. If you look at Mayor Russell, if you look at Commissioner Bennett, they're on either sides of the political equation. It is not a partisan issue. It's a people issue. And hearing them talk about it so personally, and as you stated, Matt, from a position of expertise, when you look at Senator Findley, 32 years with BLM, fire experience, a fire career. You look at Commissioner Bennett, he runs a ranch. He's dealt with fire. Mayor Russell has lived through fire. These are people who are talking from personal experience and a level of expertise. And you can't ignore that. And you can't ignore the fact, once again, it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. It's not a partisan issue. It's a people issue. And the one thing that really jumped out at me after listening to the elected officials we had on today, there's this whole notion of complacency. That is our worst and biggest enemy. We cannot ever come to the conclusion that we're safe from wildfire or uncontrolled wildfire. Everyone acknowledges that wildfires will happen. They're a part of the natural ecosystem. What we're talking about is managing the impact of uncontrolled wildfire. And that gets directly to Senator Findley's comments. Look in the mirror. You have responsibility. You can and will. And whether you know it or not, you are directly impacted by uncontrolled wildfire and by our forests not being restored or maintained in a manner that limits the damaging potential of uncontrolled wildfire. So that really stuck with me today, and I think it was a consistent theme among the panelists. And I'm looking forward to our next discussion, but I can't end without talking about where we start, and we start with those videos. They are just gut-wrenching. I can't even imagine being in someone's shoes who's seen everything they own burned to the ground. And then we talk about the investment that might, and I emphasize might, prevent that from happening. And it requires a strategic, but more importantly, a consistent level of investment to protect and preserve. And that's where we're trying to end up, a consistent level of investment to protect and preserve.
This complacency that you speak to, it's a real enemy, because you get a wet fire season and suddenly people turn to the next thing and so forth. So I think we do need to recognize that is just human nature, and we need to structurally respond to that. And one of the things that Representative Marsh is doing is actually trying to get a dedicated funding stream just to wildfire so that it doesn't tempt you to take your eye off the ball, have a dedicated funding stream year in and year out. The other thing that comes to mind is also obviously governance, leadership, and having some, a wildfire czar or somebody that is like waking up every morning, good fire season and bad, and thinking about this holistic strategy that we're talking about, which is really the essence of this cohesive strategy. Somebody that's really waking up, thinking about the health impacts, the social justice impacts. How are we impacting low-income communities with these various ways that we're paying for things? How are we protecting our firefighters and so forth? So I think this complacency issue is real, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. We need to structurally kind of respond to it. I think Mayor Russell just reiterating over and over again that times have changed. This is a new era, and we need to modernize and recognize that our former ways of doing things are just inadequate. And so if there's probably one key finding in the entire Wildfire Council report, that's it. We've entered a new era. And so as much as we might wish to cling to the way things have been done, it's just inadequate. And then you get the Labor Day events and other events that just kind of bring that home to you. It's interesting. I would say, social justice is a term that, I'm very familiar with. I think the folks here, co-hosts are very familiar with, just given, some of the other organizations that we serve. It's not a term that you often hear in the wildfire, discussion. And yet, in their own way, all of our panelists spoke to this, which is it's our most vulnerable communities that are getting hit and are most at risk, and who need the help building back their communities, and on and on. So I think that's something that really resonates. You hear the stories of these communities, and obviously that film clip, and it just really speaks to the need for us to protect our most vulnerable communities. I guess the last thing I'd say, from my observation, is this is such a huge topic that even as much as we did discuss, there's also a lot that we didn't discuss. And you think about some of the findings, like in 2018, the fire season there hurt our tourism industry by $51 million, they estimate. It's unknown right now what kind of a wine year 2020 will be, if at all. Will we have a wine year? And so you think about all the people in the state that depend on the wine industry, for jobs. You think about the farm workers. You think about all the various ripple effects that we just didn't have the time to really get to, and then also obviously just the massive issue of health. And how these fires are different. They carry particulate matter that is deadly. This is not like other smoke that we get, exposed to. And the particular, impacts to folks with pre-existing conditions, pregnant women, and the health research that's just emerging on that. And so this is a kind of an endless discussion. I think we did boil that down into some actionable recommendations in the Wildfire Council report. But obviously, on a video series like this, we just didn't have time to adequately address everything. Any final kind of wrap up comments before we move on?
Very quickly, Matt, that point you just raised, I don't think we can emphasize enough, because when you talk about smoke and particulates, it's interesting when people say, well, the fire didn't hit us. Nothing burned. Well, there's smoke in the air. There are particulates in the air. That will impact everyone, but particularly those who are in economic circumstances that won't allow them to have nice filters and other things to protect them. And that issue exists as part of our approach to addressing wildfire, meaning prescribed burns. So the issue of smoke and particulates is something that is significant in fire, that's out of control. It's significant when we're talking about controlled or prescribed fire. That is an underlying circumstance that we have to address, and it has to be front and center, because it does affect you even if the fire doesn't come to where you are. The particulates will come. So I think that's a big issue.
Yeah, and I mean, so many of our communities get their drinking water. It's another significant health source from forested watersheds, and the risks of wildfire, mudslides, contamination you see communities all across the West that are actually, issuing bonds or creating other revenue streams so that they can treat their forests around their reservoirs and around their drinking supplies. So the health impacts of wildfire are vast, and I think only just now really getting understood and starting to get the attention that they deserve. Well, I want to say thank you to both of you again. It's always good to join as co-hosts, and we'll see you in the next episode, which brings me back to the audience. So this is wrapping up episode 2. And again, this was building fire adapted communities in the era of megafires. Episode 1 again was describing the causes of these megafires and the consequences. Episode 2 is fire adapted communities. Episode 3 is going to be how do we build resilient landscapes in this era of megafire. Episode 4 will be how do we protect firefighters and give them the adequate resources. And episode 5 is going to be how do we really create the will to implement and to sustain the resources that we need. So looking forward to our next episode together, which is going to be episode 3, building fire resilient landscapes. So thank you once again. Look forward to it.
That concludes our second episode. Next week, our co-hosts will talk with experts in forest projects that utilize innovations in collaborative problem solving, remote sensing technology, and indigenous practices to improve the resilience of forests to wildfire. If you enjoyed our program today, please invite your friends, family, and colleagues to join us and learn more about wildfires. The future of our forests and our communities depends on it.